News 18 is digging deeper with our hometown conversations.
News 18 is using our platform to create education, understanding, empathy, and hope. Join us as community members talk openly and freely with us about how we can create positive change.
Before all lives can matter, we got to make sure and understand that all, Black lives matter, and I think that's something that is crucial right now.
Watch on WQOW.com/conversations.
There's been lots of calls for the removal of statues. There's, even in Minnesota, some protesters did take down the statue of Christopher Columbus. And
right.
So I think one of my first questions is why, this might sound crazy, but why do we even have them? Why do we have statues of people up?
Well, it's a great question. The thing is that, these are such interesting questions, as they're very much a thing of the past, particularly classical styled monuments where it's a figure on a pedestal. The equestrian statue, the man on a horse, was really the calling card for the late 19th, early 20th century. There's this period where people are crazy for monuments, where this was, it was a period that people in the time, contemporaries at the time, called monument mania. Because people were sort of criticizing this as, why do we have so many monuments? Why is everybody so crazy to put these up everywhere in center, in front of government buildings, in city squares? They were about giving examples literally on a pedestal, right? So you look up at it and the viewer is sort of separated from this deified figure above. And this is a figure that represents patriotism, virtue, valor, all of those things. And so you see a big push towards this exaltation of the individual. The individual represents us. You see that start to change through the 20th century, but these classical style monuments with a figure on a pedestal, they are very much an older style of thinking. And so that's kind of what you're seeing with the questioning of these now is monuments really, the calls that they're erasing history, most monuments created in this period, they're not about history. They're about creating a vision of the past and of the future. Who are we?
Okay.
Right? And so for the French Revolution, that's Marianne, the allegory of liberty and equality and fraternity. For Latin America, it was for whatever country, there's a bunch of different examples, and of what they believe themselves to be. And so there's also this idea that this firm belief that citizens in these new republics needed to see those examples in their everyday landscapes.
Okay.
Yeah, so we start to get into this idea of the power of public space, as people very much understood this, is that if you see this in your everyday landscapes, it will be impactful. This is the example that you want to live up to. And so the questions that we're looking at now is, are Confederates something that we as a nation, does it represent our values as a nation, or Columbus?
In the 1880s and 1890s, it was a progressive white idea that stems from a white idea that we're a superior civilization, that we're going to educate Ojibwe people in the ways of the white man. So we send them to school we take children from homes. A lot of people think that the boarding schools were for orphans. They weren't. They took kids out of homes with moms and dads and sent them to the reservation, sometimes as early as 6 years old, or sent them to boarding schools and taught them domestic arts like sewing or agricultural arts, farming. They're trying to make Ojibwe people assimilate them into white society. And so that lasted well into the 20th century. And part of the purpose, the stated U.S. government purpose, was to break the chains of Ojibwe culture. So if we take away their language, if we take away their way of living, then they'll assimilate into white culture, and Ojibwe culture won't be around anymore.
They have a vested interest in not allowing us to learn about things like Juneteenth or the Black Codes or Jim Crow and how Jim Crow actually operated, or restrictive covenants here in Eau Claire. They keep power by creating this fictionalized version of what happened. The problem is, though, fiction has to hit evidence And we have the evidence that this happened. We have the proof. We have the photographic proof. We have video proof. We have the documentary proof. And eventually, the fiction has to give way to the proof.
Personally, when that came about, that caused a lot of tension, you know, for just people to become more aware of racism. Because obviously it happens every day, you know, but I think the George Floyd situation really helped shed more light on everything that's going on around the world. And I think that's a good thing, because now it helps, you know, to, before all lives can matter, we got to make sure and understand that all, like, Black lives matter, you know, and I think that's something that is crucial right now, especially, you know, just me being an African-American male and going through my experience of, you know, being, you know, racism and discrimination, my experience through that, you know, but I feel like now we now have a voice for that. And moving forward, you know, I think this only just spreads more awareness, you know, and it helps people to see kind of on a larger scale of what, you know, it's not just happening in this small city, Eau Claire, it's happening all over the world.
Even once in 1920, when women got the right to vote, Black women were also had the right to vote, but they too went through the intimidation and had the same kinds of problems. So eventually, the Civil Rights Act in 1965 was what made it possible for Black men and women to vote.
Yep. The Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, all of those movements really came together to ensure that not only was it on paper that people could vote, but that it was in reality that these people were actually voting.
The younger generation is really pushing us to think about things in a much more critical way than I think we've been accustomed to. The hardest part about that is getting people to acknowledge that systemic racism does indeed exist. Education, it wasn't, you know, relatively that long ago where it was illegal for someone who looked like me to learn how to read or write. So I think the part about social justice that we're dealing with right now is the ability to be able to take all of this energy and harness it into really doing something good, changing who we are, changing the structures and knocking them down. In education, it is very important that we understand that this institution is historically one of the more racist institutions we have in this country, in terms of the history that we teach, in terms of what we acknowledge happening, in terms of the fact that this is really a melting pot for all different cultures to come to, and we teach that. We teach the classroom things, but we don't spend as a system, as a society, talking enough about those things that happen outside of the classroom that really impact our growth and development. I always tell people I am fortunate to have a job where I get to talk about the things that most people run from. You know, most people don't like to talk about race, most people don't like to talk about gender discrimination, but it's those kinds of things that can really push us toward being a better society. And I am happy that the peaceful demonstrations that are going on across society now are really pushing us and forcing us to change the way we do business. I think a lot of us have just gotten complacent, and the time for words is done. People are demanding action. We know what they're asking for. We know what they need. So it's simply time for us to start doing it.
What you have to understand is for a protest to be effective, it needs to do two things. It has to force people who don't usually deal with the issue to engage it. And it has to undermine, it has to cause a price for racism. The highway protests are the new sit-ins, and the people who yell about the highways sound literally exactly alike as the people who yelled about the sit-ins. The highways are always very careful. If you notice, they're the ones that went through the Black community and destroyed the Black businesses there. These are the people who drive right by and they never have to engage it. The highway protests forced them to engage it. It also forced them to deal with their own entitlement, that they can just drive by. The good people stop. They're not going to hit humans. The bad people are saying, I'm going to hit that protester. I'm going to hit humans. And there's no excuse for saying, I'm going to drive a car into protesters. Really, that's saying only some lives matter. if you advocate hitting protesters, you don't believe all lives matter. And to be honest, all lives should matter, but the reality is there's a bunch of lives that don't matter. We don't care about prisoners. We don't care about people who we have labeled criminal. We don't care about people who we label subhuman. We don't care about people who we see as disruptive. I mean, if all lives mattered, we wouldn't have a pro-life movement in this country, would we? But that pro-life movement seems to forget about people once they're out the womb. So, you know, you look at that, it's meant to be provocative. It's meant to create a price to commerce. It's meant to create a price. And they're being treated exactly the way the people in the sit-ins did. Because when people of color were just the ones asking for the monuments to come down, the government's easily ignored us. White people came in and pulled those things down. You know, and the question is, why did it take that? Why couldn't they listen to us? You have to have the white allies before they pay attention to you. That is the sad part of it. It wasn't enough for black people to say no. It wasn't enough for indigenous people to say no. There had to be white allies there saying, well, they're right, for this to be taken seriously.
Every county in Wisconsin, all 72, have some sort of county history. Usually they're produced in the 19-teens or 20s. And so they always start out with this chapter. You know, the first settler breaks the land, comes with his plow and his oxen, and sees this vacant land, right? And so he's the person who helps tame the wilderness. And the first white baby is born, you know, and that's how the first chapter is taken up. But of course, the land is not empty. He's had a lot of help from the government getting title to his land, and all of that is this grand fantasy of this independent yeoman farmer who comes upon this empty continent and tames it. It's one of those sort of wild fantasies that we have, or that they land at Green Bay and then he comes in with his red cape, right, and discovers that he's on his way to China, right? So, and of course that's not, that is an absolute fabrication. He is in no way, French people have been in North America for 30 years. He doesn't think he's going to China. He knows.
He knows what he's doing.
He knows what the other side of Lake Michigan looks like, right? And so it's just one of those daft stories that we tell ourselves, and we tell them in school.
What does this mean for us as a society? Is it something we want on the pedestal? Is this the example of patriotism and virtue? And some of these they're all complex conversations. That's the thing. Nothing is black and white. History is very complex.
Right.
And the statues, monuments I love monuments. I've studied them for a long time, but they're a flawed way to understand the past.